A black honor student is dragged from his seat mid-flight, accused of stealing a laptop that wasn't missing. The white passenger points, the crew believes him, and within seconds, security cuffs the boy while his mother screams. Cameras roll. No apology, no investigation. But what no one knows is the boy was flying to accept a national math award, and he's about to expose them all. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The humid Michigan air hung thick as the morning sun poured through streaked windows of Jefferson Middle School. Inside room 204 the bell had just rung, and the class was settling into their seats. A room with paint peeling off the corners, and desks covered in decades of carved initials. The scent of pencil shavings and old books hung in the air. Today something was different. A guest was coming. Not just any guest. A professor from Cambridge. Dr. Harrison Whitmore carried himself like royalty. White hair slicked back, suit perfectly tailored, and a crisp British accent that seemed to silence even the rowdiest students. The flyers had hyped his visit all week. Internationally recognized Cambridge mathematician, one-day special lecture. The kids didn't really care. Most had never heard of him. But teachers treated him like a visiting king. In a low-income, mostly black school like Jefferson, guests like Whitmore rarely came. When they did, they left a mark. He entered with a kind smile, briefcase in one hand, laser pointer in the other, and began by introducing his accolades, research and travels across the globe. The PowerPoint screen flashed with complex equations, graphs and ancient Greek symbols. Some kids stared blankly. Others whispered. In the back row sat a quiet 7th grader named Miles Carter. Shoulders hunched, fingers twitching nervously around the edges of a worn-out notebook. Miles wasn't the loud type. He had no trophies, no awards, no front-row spotlight. His teachers saw him as average, respectful, quiet, nothing to worry about. His math grades were average too, mostly B-minuses. But nobody noticed that he finished his worksheets before the others. Nobody noticed how he never used a calculator, only mental math. And nobody knew he'd once fixed his mom's tax return when TurboTax kept glitching. He didn't brag. He didn't raise his hand. He simply observed. Dr. Whitmore moved through the lecture at lightning pace, pausing at a particularly intimidating equation, a decades-old unsolved algebraic problem that even grad students struggled with. He smiled theatrically. This one here, he tapped the board. This little monster has stumped many of my students. But perhaps, unless one of you fine young athletes has a hidden mathematical gift. He chuckled. Then his eyes casually flicked toward Miles. The pause was microscopic, maybe a second, but everyone noticed. The students froze, then a few snickered. One kid muttered, "Damn," under his breath. The message was clear, even if wrapped in sarcasm. Miles was a black boy, tall for his age, lean build, wore sneakers and a faded hoodie. In Dr. Whitmore's eyes, he looked like a football player, not a future mathematician. Miles didn't laugh. He didn't react. His mind went silent, but not numb. Inside something ancient stirred. A heavy bone-deep ache he couldn't name. It wasn't just about this professor. It was about every time someone looked at him and saw only his body, not his mind. Every time he was overlooked in class projects. Every time a teacher assumed he copied from someone else. Every single moment his brilliance had been ignored. Miss Ellison, their regular math teacher, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Her silence sealed the room. When the bell rang, the room erupted with chatter and backpack zippers. Dr. Whitmore thanked the class and began packing. Miles stayed seated, eyes locked on the whiteboard. On that equation, it wasn't just numbers to him anymore. It was a wall, one built not just of math but of expectations. And for the first time, he wanted to tear it down. Later that afternoon, while the school emptied, Miles quietly slipped into the library. The librarian, Mrs. Harding, raised an eyebrow, but didn't stop him. No one ever saw Miles there after hours. He headed straight for the math section, a row so dusty it looked untouched in years. He pulled out an old textbook on algebraic theory, heavy enough to crush a cat. He opened it and began flipping pages furiously, cross-referencing the notes he had jotted earlier. There it was. The equation. He didn't understand everything yet, but some pieces made sense. Patterns, sequences, logical leaps. Where others saw gibberish, Miles saw rhythm. His fingers moved as if playing a piano, tracing over the symbols, connecting dots no one told him existed. At home that night, while his mother dozed off after her second shift, Miles sat under a weak desk lamp in the kitchen, surrounded by scribbled paper, open textbooks, and a calculator with missing buttons. The table creaked every time he leaned forward, but he was locked in. Something electric was surging inside him, not adrenaline but clarity. For hours, he wrote, erased, rewrote, crossed out pages, started over. Time disappeared. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. At exactly 2:46 a.m., his pencil stopped. He stared at what he had written. There at the bottom of the page was a breakthrough. A piece of the puzzle that even Dr. Whitmore hadn't mentioned. Something small, subtle, but game-changing. His hands trembled as he held the paper up to the light. Could it be? Could he really be the first to see this? His heartbeat quickened, but instead of feeling proud, he felt terrified. What if no one believed him? What if they thought he cheated? What if he wasn't allowed to be this smart? But the numbers didn't lie. He didn't cheat. And he knew, deep down, that he had just solved something no one thought he could. Miles stared at the textbook's final page, then at his notes, and saw something no one else had ever noticed. The kitchen was silent except for the soft scratch of pencil against paper. Miles sat hunched under a flickering bulb, the only source of light in the tiny apartment that smelled faintly of cooking oil and old wood. His mother's soft snoring came from the small room adjacent to the kitchen, her exhausted body draped across a sagging couch she used as a bed. She had come home from her second shift, barely touched the reheated leftovers Miles had plated for her, and collapsed without a word. Their apartment in East Detroit was part of a crumbling housing block that reeked of neglect. Rust stained the faucets. A crack ran down the middle of their bathroom mirror, and sirens passed outside more nights than not. But it was home, a home held together by the sheer will of a single mother working 3 jobs. Cashier at a grocery store, janitor at a local office, and part-time caregiver for an elderly couple. Her name was Nadine Carter, and she was Miles's entire world. No one at Jefferson Middle School saw Miles as a genius. His records showed what teachers expected: average grades, inconsistent homework, and no extracurriculars. But those records didn't know that Miles often stayed up tutoring himself with discarded library books. That he memorized math symbols, not through lectures but through instinct. That his mind worked in silent revolutions, spinning complex patterns behind tired eyes. Now the discarded equation from Dr. Whitmore's lecture lay redrawn across 6 sheets of paper, taped together, curling at the edges. Miles studied it with an intensity that would have unnerved most adults. Not just studying, dissecting it, feeling the logic, sensing the direction of its puzzle. Every few minutes he scribbled notes in the margins, murmuring equations under his breath. There was no internet in the apartment. The computer was broken. He didn't have fancy graphing calculators or tutorial videos. What he had was intuition, and a mind that burned with something raw and untrained. The radiator groaned in protest as the temperature dropped. Miles pulled his hoodie tighter, but his focus didn't waver. His fingers were blackened with pencil lead, the side of his hand stained from dragging it across his work. 1 equation, 3 variables, too many unknowns. Except, maybe not. He noticed a pattern in the middle variables. A symmetry not addressed in any of the textbooks. It had to be coincidence. But when he restructured the equation with the altered variable alignment, something clicked. The numbers weren't fighting anymore. They were aligning, like tumblers in a lock. He stared at the paper, then stared harder. This wasn't supposed to happen. He double-checked it, triple-checked. What he'd written down, it shouldn't be possible. He shouldn't be seeing it. Not without graduate training, not without a mentor, not without hundreds of hours of instruction. But there it was, a hole in the equation that nobody else had seen. He looked up, his eyes wide, breathing unsteady. The silence of the apartment suddenly felt heavy, like the air had thickened around him. Outside, a car engine revved aggressively. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried. Life continued. Unaware that inside apartment 3C, a 13-year-old had just made academic history, and no one would believe him. Miles sat back and blinked at the ceiling. His chest tight with something he couldn't name: fear. This wasn't just about solving a problem anymore. This was about what would come after. Would they say he cheated? Would they believe a black kid from a broken home cracked something Cambridge had given up on? Would they think someone helped him? Would they look at his mother and see her worn shoes and call it a scam? His stomach churned. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and Miles jumped. He looked over at his mother, still asleep, her hand hanging over the edge of the couch. Her fingers were stained with cleaning chemicals. Miles felt a tear slide down his cheek, not from sadness but from the pressure of carrying something no one had prepared him for. This was the first time he wished he had someone to show it to. A mentor. A guide. A voice to say, "Yes, Miles. You're right. You're brilliant." But there was no one. Not yet. He glanced at the time. He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper, wrote out the full corrected equation, and folded it carefully. Then, with trembling hands, he slid it into the back of his math notebook. He didn't know what he'd do with it yet, but something told him this wasn't over. As he turned off the lamp and crawled under the blanket on the floor beside the couch, Miles couldn't sleep. Not because he wasn't tired, but because his brain refused to slow down. The equation was alive in his mind, shifting, whispering, evolving. He wasn't just some poor black boy anymore. He was holding a secret that could tear apart everything people assumed about him. At 3:18 a.m., with eyes wide open in the dark, Miles realized he might have just cracked the impossible, and tomorrow someone might try to take it from him. The morning after Miles made his late-night discovery, his walk to school felt different. Not faster or slower, just heavier. The notebook in his backpack might as well have been made of bricks. Inside it was the answer, or at least an answer. Miles wasn't completely sure what he'd uncovered, but he knew one thing: he had to show someone, and he knew exactly how. When he stepped into room 24, he could still hear faint echoes of Dr. Whitmore's voice from the day before. Still see the smug smirk behind that polished British accent. Some kids were laughing about it in the hallway earlier, mocking the way the professor had dismissed him. One of them even threw a lazy football spiral in Miles's direction, and joked, "Yo QB, got your cleats." Miles just kept walking. He sat in his usual seat at the back, notebook clutched in his hands. The classroom was noisy. The morning buzz of kids who didn't expect anything remarkable to happen. Miss Ellison was reviewing last night's worksheet on the overhead projector, half distracted, half tired. Then Miles did something he'd never done before. He stood up. No one noticed at first, not until he walked past the third row. Then a few heads turned. When he reached the whiteboard, the room fell into a kind of suspended silence, the kind that makes air feel thinner. Even Ellison blinked in confusion. "Miles?" she asked, half a question, half a warning. But he didn't answer. Instead, he opened his notebook. The room watched in complete confusion as he picked up a marker and carefully, deliberately began erasing the faded chalk residue from the bottom half of the board. Then he started writing. At first, it was just numbers, symbols, notations. But by the second line, something strange began to happen. Something subtle, like a slow tide pulling away from the shore. The classroom energy shifted. The math he was writing wasn't just familiar. It was the equation. The one Dr. Whitmore had displayed. The one that had stumped the room. And now here was Miles. Quiet Miles. Rewriting it, line by line with a calm so precise it looked rehearsed. But it wasn't rehearsed. It was instinct. By the time he reached the fourth line, the room was dead silent. One kid, Dre, slowly took out his phone under the desk and began recording. Miss Ellison stepped forward but didn't interrupt. Her eyes were locked on the board. Miles finished the equation, then underlined it, and without looking up he began to solve it. Each step was deliberate. Each calculation snapped into place like a puzzle finding its edge pieces. He didn't rush. He didn't pause to see who was watching. He just worked calmly, methodically, brilliantly. When he reached the midpoint where even grad students usually fumbled, he introduced a variable realignment that made Ms. Ellison gasp softly. Her hand instinctively went to her mouth. She wasn't just watching a student solve a hard problem. She was watching something impossible. He continued, unblinking. Some kids leaned forward in their seats. Others stared slack-jawed. One girl whispered, "Is he for real?" By the final line, when Miles circled his answer, the room was so still you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then he stepped back. No smug smile. No grand gesture. He just looked at the board. Ms. Ellison walked forward slowly, scanning each line like she was reading a sacred text. "Miles, where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "I didn't," he replied quietly. "I just figured it out." Silent. Then Dre's voice broke through from the back. "Yo, that's the same thing that British dude wrote." Miles looked down. His hands were trembling, but he forced them back to his sides. Ms. Ellison turned toward the class. Everyone, sit down, phones away.
But Dre had already hit upload.
The video was already spreading. He'd posted it to TikTok with the caption, "Quiet kid just cooked the Cambridge guy." By the time lunch rolled around, the video had over 12,000 views. By sixth period it passed 6. In that evening, somewhere across the Atlantic, a junior researcher at Cambridge University opened the clip during her break and immediately emailed it to her department chair. Within hours, someone from Cambridge forwarded the video to Dr. Whitmore with just 4 words. "Is this your equation?" The morning after Miles Carter's classroom video went viral, his world changed, but not in the way fairy tales promise. Instead of celebration, what followed was a slow creeping shadow of suspicion masked behind smiles. He woke to the buzz of his old Android phone skittering across the wooden floor beside his mattress. Notifications stacked like bricks. Text, DMs, mentions, tags. His thumb scrolled through hundreds of comments as the screen lit up with usernames he didn't recognize. One read, "Who is this kid? Someone give him a scholarship." Another, "Incredible brain. But did he really do this alone?" And then, chillingly direct, "No way a 7th grader from Detroit cracked a Cambridge equation. This is some kind of hoax." Miles sat still for a long moment. His heart split between pride and dread. He'd solved something no one expected him to even understand. But the world's first instinct wasn't to believe him. It was to doubt him. Because he was young. Because he was poor. And because he was black. At school he noticed how teachers now looked at him with forced warmth, as if compensating. Students whispered in huddles. Some seemed impressed. Others looked at him like he'd cheated the system. Like he had stolen a crown meant for someone else. Before third period, the school PA summoned him to the office. In the principal's office, he found not only Principal Monroe but also a stranger. A woman in a crisp navy blazer, designer handbag, and the kind of expensive perfume that lingered like authority. She introduced herself as Ms. Langley, a media liaison for the district. "Miles," she said brightly, "you've made quite the splash. The media is buzzing. People want to meet you, and if you're okay with it, we've arranged a short interview with Channel 9 tonight. Just a small segment. Something positive." Miles nodded hesitantly. "I guess so." He didn't know what to expect. But his mother, Nadine, would. She always knew how to read people. When Nadine received the call, she was on her hands and knees scrubbing a stairwell in a downtown law office. Her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket, the ringtone barely audible over her cleaning playlist. A voice on the line said, "We'd love for you to join your son in a short TV feature. It'll be inspiring. Just a feel-good piece about his talent." Nadine hesitated. Something in the producer's tone felt too slick, too rehearsed. But she didn't want to hold her son back. She wiped her hands on her jeans and agreed. That evening, they arrived at the Channel 9 studio. Miles wore his only collared shirt, slightly too tight at the shoulders. Nadine wore her best church blouse. In the waiting room, no one offered them water. No one spoke to them with the warmth they reserved for other guests. A young assistant guided Miles into the makeup room, while Nadine waited behind the cameras. She crossed her arms tightly, watching every movement. A woman in heels dabbed powder on Miles's forehead, while a producer adjusted lighting. Then the host entered. Emily Thorne. White, blonde, radiating a kind of practiced empathy that felt more like performance than sincerity. "Hi there, genius," she beamed. "We're gonna have some fun, okay?" Miles nodded, trying to hide his discomfort. When the cameras rolled, Emily leaned in with a polished smile. "So Miles," she began, "tell us, how does a young man from Detroit manage to outsmart Cambridge professors?" "I just saw the pattern," Miles said simply. "It made sense to me." Emily's eyebrows lifted theatrically. "Wow. Did anyone help you? A teacher, maybe? Your mom?" "No. I worked it out on my own." "Fascinating," she said, stretching the word like gum. "You're very lucky. A lot of young men in your situation don't get these chances." That word, situation. Nadine's face froze. Her hands tightened around the strap of her purse. It wasn't what she said. It was what she meant. The coded language. The way your situation replaced words like poverty, broken home, black. It was racism delivered with a smile, camouflaged behind compliments. The interview wrapped with a fake laugh and a rehearsed handshake. Miles and Nadine were ushered out without ceremony. No follow-ups. No rides home. In the car, Nadine stared out the window for a long time before finally speaking. They don't think you belong in that chair. I know, Miles said softly. The next morning at school, Dre rushed up to him in the hallway. Bro, you seen this? Look. He shoved his phone into Miles's hand. It was a blurry video, clearly recorded without permission. The scene. Emily Thorne off camera, brushing her hair back, chatting with a producer. Emily laughed. These stories write themselves, don't they? Little black boy from nowhere stumbles onto a big equation. Please. Probably got coached. Or just got lucky. The producer chuckled. Yeah. I saw him in makeup. Kid looked lost. He makes good TV though. Miles stared at the screen, his mouth dry. Dre's smile faded. Yup. That's messed up, man. Miles didn't answer. He just handed the phone back and walked away. That afternoon, a journalist from an independent outlet posted the leaked footage with the caption, "Behind the scenes of last night's interview. You decide. Was it admiration or exploitation?" Within hours, the internet exploded. Again. Miles's moment of recognition was no longer just a feel-good story. It had become a battleground for race, bias, and truth, and this time, Cambridge was watching. The backlash didn't come like a storm. It came like a fog, creeping in silently, clouding every hallway of Jefferson Middle with unease. In the world outside, Miles Carter had become a spark of hope, a viral story, a symbol, a prodigy. But inside the very school, where he first stunned the world, his name vanished like a rumor that had worn out its welcome. There was no school-wide announcement, no assembly, no certificate or morning shout-out, just silence. Deafening, deliberate silence. By Tuesday, the whispers in the teacher's lounge had grown louder than the applause on the internet. Instead of being hailed as a local hero, Miles became the distraction. Ms. Ellison, who had once watched him solve the unsolvable with tears in her eyes, now barely made eye contact, and when she did, it was with the quiet guilt of someone watching a miracle slowly erased. That same day, Vice Principal Renshaw stopped Miles in the hallway. His voice was low and measured. "You need to keep a lower profile," he said. "This whole situation is attracting the wrong kind of attention." Miles stared at him. "I didn't ask for this. I know. But there are parents, board members, questioning if all this press is in the school's best interest. This place isn't built to handle that kind of spotlight." It was the first time Miles heard what they truly feared. Not failure, but excellence in the wrong body. Back in class, his math teacher, Mr. Bowen, handed back a test with no grade, only a sticky note reading, "See me after class." When Miles approached his desk, Bowen didn't look up. "These answers, they're not just right. They're ahead of the curriculum. Way ahead," Bowen said slowly. "Makes people wonder." "I didn't cheat," Miles replied, voice barely above a whisper. "I never said you did. I'm just saying, people are watching. And sometimes when something looks too good to be true." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The quiet racism was louder than ever now. It didn't come in slurs or punishments. It came in doubt, in suggestions, in warnings disguised as advice. By Friday, the news hit harder. Miss Langley, the district's media handler, returned. She held a meeting with Principal Monroe behind closed doors. That afternoon, Miles and his mother were summoned to the office. Monroe was composed, polite, his hands folded neatly on his desk. "Given the circumstances," he began, "we've decided it's best not to nominate Miles for the state STEM showcase." Nadine blinked slowly. "Excuse me. We feel that at this time, Miles should focus on stability. Academics. There's been a lot of attention, pressure, and the showcase would only magnify it." "You mean the only student in this building solving college-level math problems is too successful for a competition about gifted students?" Nadine said, voice icy. "There are other considerations. Attendance, classroom behavior, community representation." Miles looked down. The air in the office went still. They weren't questioning his talent. They were questioning his belonging. That night, Nadine sat at their small kitchen table, still in her uniform, her cleaning gloves tossed on the floor beside her. She didn't speak for a long time. Miles sat across from her, notebook unopened, untouched. The fire in her eyes burned slowly now, not in anger, but in purpose. "They think they can bury this," she said finally. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." She reached into her purse and pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper. On it was a name she'd written months ago. back when a woman she cleaned for had told her about a mathematician who had retired nearby, a man who'd worked for NASA, written in journals, and been ignored by history books. Dr. Isaiah Jennings. Without hesitation, Nadine picked up the phone. Hello? A deep, slow voice answered. Dr. Jennings, you don't know me. My name is Nadine Carter. I'm a cleaning lady. But you need to know my son. There was a pause. Then the voice said, Tell me everything. 2 days later, on a gray Sunday morning, a knock echoed through their apartment. Miles opened the door slowly. Standing in the hallway was a tall, older black man in a brown wool coat, silver hair, and thick glasses. He carried nothing but a weathered notebook and a quiet gaze filled with experience and recognition. You must be the genius they're trying to bury, he said. Miles stepped aside, and the man entered, not as a savior but as a mirror of everything Miles might become, if the world didn't stop him first. The moment Dr. Isaiah Jennings stepped inside the Carter household, the air shifted, not in volume, but in weight. His presence brought with it a calm that wasn't passive. It was composed, practiced. This wasn't a man who needed to prove his intelligence. He was intelligence walking, breathing, quiet power. He didn't make small talk, didn't comment on the peeling paint or the lack of furniture. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, opened his notebook, and looked at Miles with the kind of gaze that demands precision. I want to see what you saw, he said. Miles hesitated. Then, slowly, he pulled out the wrinkled sheets he had kept hidden since the night he solved the equation. He laid them flat on the table, nervous under the weight of this stranger's silence. Dr. Jennings read every line. He didn't react, didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply nodded, once, then tapped the midpoint of Miles's solution. You flipped the variable relationship, he said, where most people accept the symmetry as fixed. That's not luck, that's intuition. Miles didn't know what to say, but Jennings didn't expect a reply. Do you know why people don't believe you? He asked softly. Because they've been taught that brilliance looks a certain way, speaks a certain way, comes from certain places. You don't fit the formula, so they call you the error. Miles lowered his eyes. Jennings leaned closer. But I've spent my whole life watching people confuse errors with innovation. From that moment, mentorship began. Not with ceremony, but with structure. Dr. Jennings returned every afternoon, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3. He never brought a laptop, only pens, scratch paper, and equations. He taught Miles not with lectures, but through discipline. They would sit side by side in the kitchen, working through problems the size of skyscrapers. The air would grow hot, their hands blackened by ink and graphite. Jennings didn't praise. He corrected. He refined. He drilled Miles in the art of mathematical patience, of resisting easy assumptions, of thinking like a system rather than a student. And Miles, hungry for something the world had tried to starve out of him, devoured every lesson. At school, the cold shoulders continued. His teachers no longer asked questions. Administrators avoided his name. The silence became suffocating. But Miles no longer needed their recognition. He had found someone who saw him, not as a prodigy, not as a symbol, but as a mind worth sharpening. Dr. Jennings introduced him to discarded theorems, failed proofs, unsolved ideas that had gathered dust since the 1970s. He showed him a folder titled Whitmore Errors, a collection of flawed assumptions made by none other than Harrison Whitmore, the same professor who had dismissed Miles as probably only good at sports. Miles leaned over the table, his eyes scanning each flawed step. He built an empire on being almost right, Jennings said. Together they worked through those errors, not to mock Whitmore but to transcend him. They began recreating the very proof Whitmore had presented at Jefferson, the one he claimed was too advanced for middle school minds. Line by line, Miles retraced it, not to copy it, to dismantle it. What emerged over weeks of late-night work was something new, not a corrected version, a replacement, a fluid, adaptive equation that resolved a persistent paradox in theoretical modeling. Jennings called it responsive symmetry. Miles simply called it his. Jennings stood behind him one evening, hands on the back of Miles's chair. You realize this isn't just math anymore, he said. It's politics. It's power. What you've done here will threaten people who've made their careers convincing the world that minds like yours don't exist. Miles swallowed hard. So what do I do? You finish it, Jennings said. And then you make them read it. That weekend, Jennings drafted an anonymous email and attached the completed solution. It was addressed to a handful of mathematicians around the world. People who had ignored him for years. He didn't sign it. Didn't explain it. The subject line was a single sentence. This was written by the boy your system tried to erase. Days passed, then weeks. And then, without warning, it happened. A letter arrived at the Carter apartment. Hand-delivered, sealed with the Cambridge University emblem. Nadine opened it at the table, eyes darting across the page. Her voice cracked. They want you to speak. Miles blinked. Where? Nadine handed him the letter. An invitation from Cambridge University to present at the International Mathematics Symposium, a prestigious platform, rarely offered. Never to children. Never to unknowns. Never to black boys from Detroit. Miles read the final line aloud. We hope you will attend, though some of our faculty still have questions about the authenticity of the work. The sting wasn't in the offer. It was in the doubt that came with it. The invitation from Cambridge lingered in the air for days like a strange prophecy. Thrilling, frightening, impossible. Miles carried the letter in his backpack like a secret weapon, reading it between classes, touching the embossed seal as if it might vanish. Even then, the doubt burned into the final line echoed like a warning. But Nadine refused to let anything dim the moment. We're going, she said firmly. They're gonna see you. Really see you. Not through a screen. Not through somebody else's story. There was no budget for flights, no savings account, no spare funds to pull from. But when the news broke publicly that Cambridge had extended an invitation, a community fund started circulating online. Black scholars, activists, teachers, strangers, contributed what they could. A local organization donated 2 passports. A small Detroit travel agency offered discounted tickets. Piece by piece, the world lifted Miles toward the place that once dismissed him. 2 weeks later, Miles stood at the Detroit airport holding a carry-on bag that wasn't even fully zipped, wearing the only jacket he owned. Nadine fussed over his passport 3 times before they reached security. You sure you have it? Mom? Yeah, Miles said, gripping it tightly. I'm not letting go. The airport felt like a different world. Rolling suitcases, intercom announcements, fluorescent lights, people with places to be. As they approached TSA, Miles straightened his shoulders, the way Dr. Jennings had instructed him. Look confident, not scared, Jennings had said. They read fear like it's math. But confidence didn't stop the stares. At the security line, a TSA officer motioned for Miles to step aside. You traveling alone? The officer asked. No. With my mom, Miles said. The officer's eyes flicked toward Nadine as though searching for inconsistencies. What's the purpose of your trip? He's invited to speak at a university, Nadine answered. Which one? Nadine exhaled sharply. Cambridge? The officer paused, scanning Miles again as if he needed to adjust the picture in his head. Then he waved them through with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Inside the terminal, seat after seat was filled with white passengers flipping through magazines or tapping on laptops. Miles found himself shrinking a little, not wanting to draw attention. Nadine placed a hand on his back. You walk in here exactly like you walked into that classroom, she whispered. Head high. The call for boarding echoed through the speakers, and they took their seats in row 28, middle and window. The aisle seat was occupied by a middle-aged white man in a business suit. He barely glanced up as Miles sat down. For the first hour of the flight, everything felt normal enough. Miles watched clouds drift below, imagining equations swirling inside them. Nadine slept lightly, her hand resting over her purse. The man next to them typed furiously on his laptop, occasionally glancing at Miles as if he were intruding on oxygen. It happened during beverage service. The flight attendant had just moved on when the man began patting his pockets. Where's my wallet? He muttered. He checked under his laptop, inside his jacket, beneath his seat. His voice grew sharper. It was right here, he said, panic rising. Nadine woke instantly.
You lose something, she asked.
My wallet, he snapped. Then his eyes cut sharply toward Miles. The silence was instant, suffocating. Miles froze. I didn't touch. I saw you shift in your seat earlier, the man said, voice loud enough for nearby passengers to turn. Kids like you are fast. You could have slipped your hand in without me noticing. Sir, Nadine said slowly. Watch yourself. But he wasn't watching himself. He was watching Miles, the only black boy in his row. His suspicion had a target the moment the wallet disappeared. I want the attendant, the man demanded. I'm not sitting here until he's checked. All eyes turned to Miles, He felt his throat tighten, a familiar heat rising behind his ears. The feeling of being accused, not because of evidence but because of expectation. The attendant returned, attempting calm. "Sir, we can help you look, but we can't accuse." "I am accusing him," the man said, pointing directly at Miles. A woman across the aisle pulled out her phone. Miles's voice trembled. "I didn't take anything." Nadine stood now, heart pounding. "My son didn't steal your wallet. You check again, thoroughly." The man scoffed. "Of course you'd say that." It escalated quickly. Whispers, stares, murmurs. Passengers exchanged glances heavy with judgment. A second attendant arrived. "Sir, we'll check the surrounding area," she said. "But calm is important. Check him," the man insisted. "Kids from, well, you know." The insinuation hung in the air, like poison. Miles felt his chest tighten as the attendant knelt to search under his seat. Nadine placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, grounding him. Minutes passed like slow torture. Then, a voice. "It's here." Everyone turned. A woman seated 2 rows back held up a leather wallet. "It must have fallen when you walked past earlier," she said. The man's face drained. He blinked, embarrassed, but not enough to apologize. "Oh, well, good, that's sorted then." The attendants looked annoyed. The passengers looked relieved, and still no one looked at Miles. No apology, no acknowledgement. He had been tried, judged and cleared, all without moving from his seat. Nadine sat slowly, her jaw trembling with rage. Miles stared ahead, feeling something fragile inside him crack. Not a breakdown, a breaking open. He didn't cry until much later, quietly, as the cabin lights dimmed and the world outside became black ocean. Hours later, as the plane descended toward the UK, the cabin lights flickered on, and people stirred awake. Nadine reached over and touched Miles's hand gently. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm fine," he said, wiping his cheek. "Just tired." But he wasn't tired. He was worn from carrying the burden of proving innocence in a world that assumed guilt. Just as the wheels prepared to touch down, his phone buzzed, a notification from an unknown number. Miles glanced at the screen. "Stay in your place. Cambridge doesn't need you." His blood turned cold. Nadine noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" Miles turned the phone so she could read it. Her eyes widened. "Who sent that?" "I don't know," he whispered. "Delete it," she said quickly, anxiety wrapping around her voice. "Don't show anyone yet." But Miles didn't delete it. He stared at it long after the plane touched the runway. Not out of fear, but out of realization. This wasn't just about math anymore. This was about who was allowed to ride. And someone, somewhere, wanted him grounded. As the plane slowed to a stop, a second message appeared, this time with a photo of Miles in the airport earlier that morning. Someone was watching him. When the plane doors opened at Heathrow, the sterile blast of English air hit Miles like a slap of ice. It wasn't the cold that chilled him. It was the tension still vibrating under his skin. The photo, the message, the knowledge that someone was tracking him. He said nothing to Nadine, but it showed in how he walked, slower, more careful, as though waiting for a hand to reach from behind and pull him back. The black car that Cambridge had sent met them at the terminal. The driver was polite, almost too polite, offering them bottled water and asking 0 questions. He drove in silence, the kind of silence that isn't awkward, but calculated. Outside, the countryside blurred into cobblestone and chapels, into lawns so precisely trimmed they looked artificial. And then, as the car turned a final corner, there it was, Cambridge University. It looked like something carved from time, Gothic arches, ivy draping centuries-old walls, stained glass that shimmered with history. Miles stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass. The place didn't feel real. It felt like a fortress, not just of knowledge, but of control. As they stepped out, the administrative assistant waiting for them didn't smile. She wore a tight bun, navy blazer, and a badge that read Honorary Guest Liaison. "You'll be staying in the visiting quarters," she said briskly. "Orientation begins at 9 a.m. sharp. Professor Whitmore is expecting you." Nadine glanced at Miles. He didn't flinch, just nodded. Their room was cold and sterile, high ceilings, stone floors, and a radiator that coughed heat like an old man trying to clear his throat. Nadine set down their bags and looked around. "This place ain't made for us," she muttered. Miles sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his phone. There were no more messages, no more threats, but the silence felt heavier than before. The next morning, the campus buzzed with students in scarves and overcoats, books tucked under arms, coffee cups in hand. They didn't stare outright, but they did pause. They whispered. Some glanced at Miles and then looked away as if unsure whether to treat him like a prodigy or a scandal. Inside the main lecture hall, Professor Harrison Whitmore stood waiting. The same man who had once joked that Miles was probably only good at sports. He looked up from his notes with a cordial smile that never reached his eyes.
Mr. Carter, he said, you've caused quite the stir.
Miles didn't respond. Nadine crossed her arms. Whitmore gestured toward a seat in the back. You'll be observing today's session. We've reserved a spot for you. Observing? Nadine asked. Yes, Whitmore replied smoothly. We'd prefer Mr. Carter doesn't speak during the symposium itself. Not just yet. There are protocols, structures. He was invited to speak, she said sharply. Of course, but we thought it best to first see how his insights align with our curriculum. There it was again.
The polite racism.
Disguised as process, framed as structure, drenched in hierarchy. Miles sat quietly, his face unreadable, but Nadine didn't miss the way his hands clenched around the notebook in his lap. The lecture began. Professors in tailored suits presented slides filled with complex formulas. Graduate students nodded thoughtfully, asking rehearsed questions. The language was dense, academic, intentionally designed to exclude. To Miles, it felt like watching a magician explain a trick he already knew the secret to. Whitmore stood at the front, tracing symbols on the board with performative elegance. And this, of course, he said, brings us back to the central question of unbalanced vectors. A problem still unresolved. Miles's pencil snapped. Heads turned. He picked up the broken piece and slipped it into his pocket. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Something wrong, Mr. Carter? Miles looked up, voice calm. That's not unresolved. Gasps rippled. Nadine felt her stomach twist. Whitmore chuckled. Is that so? Miles didn't answer. He just opened his notebook, flipped to the page, and held it up. The equation glared in black ink. A version of Whitmore's problem, restructured, simplified, and solved. Whitmore's smile faltered. I see, he said. Well, perhaps we can discuss it later, privately. The rest of the session crawled. Miles didn't speak again, but the silence around him changed. Professors whispered behind their hands. Students eyed him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Later, in the corridor, Nadine pulled him aside. We don't have to stay, she said. You don't owe them a damn thing. Yes, I do, Miles replied. To who? To the next black kid who walks through these halls. I'm not leaving. That evening, as the campus quieted under the weight of twilight, Miles walked alone down a corridor lined with portraits of dead white men. Each one stared down like a warning. He stopped at Whitmore's office. The door was locked. The hallway empty. Miles reached into his backpack, pulled out a folded sheet, the final version of his own theorem, the one Jennings had helped him refine, and slid it into the office mailbox. No note, no signature, just math. As he turned to leave, he noticed a camera mounted above the door, its red light blinking steadily, watching, recording, and suddenly, Miles wasn't sure if he'd just started a conversation or a war. Professor Harrison Whitmore rarely checked his own mailbox. Normally, his assistant would gather, sort and summarize its contents, neatly arranging them by relevance. But on this particular morning, something pushed him to do it himself. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was ego, or maybe it was the weight of a quiet challenge he hadn't been able to shake. Whatever it was, when he twisted the brass key and pulled open the small metallic door, what he found wasn't fan mail or spam. It was a single sheet of folded paper. No name, no stamp, just numbers. He unfolded it. At first glance, the handwriting struck him as amateur. Ink smudged, characters tightly packed, but as his eyes followed the equations, line after line, his breath caught. It was familiar, uncomfortably so. Then suddenly, unsettlingly, it was his equation. Not copied, not plagiarized, corrected. What he held in his hands was a reconstruction of his most published theorem, one he had lectured on, defended, and built his academic reputation around. But this version didn't just improve it, it undid him. It exposed the flaws he had ignored for years, flaws covered by reputation, not rigor. He read the proof again. Then again. The solution didn't feel forced. It felt effortless, as if the math had always wanted to flow this way. as if someone had just finally listened. Without saying a word to anyone, Whitmore stormed out of his office and made his way to the seminar hall, where Miles Carter had been sitting silently all week. His shoes echoed sharply against the tile, anger tightening with every step. Miles was in the back row, scribbling notes, his head tilted slightly in focus. He didn't notice the door fly open until Whitmore's voice broke through the room like a snapped brand. "Mr. Carter," he barked, waving the paper. Miles looked up, calm, steady. "Yes, Professor. Where did you get this?" Whitmore demanded, holding the page like it burned. "I wrote it," Miles answered. Whitmore scoffed. "You corrected it. My structure. My framework." "It wasn't balanced," Miles said, standing slowly. "You stabilized one side using assumptions that don't resolve across long-form parity. I realigned the vector load." Whitmore's jaw clenched. Miles didn't wait for permission. He walked to the chalkboard, picked up a stick of white chalk, and without a hint of hesitation began writing. He didn't look at Whitmore. He didn't look at the crowd that slowly began to gather outside the open door. He looked at the math. Each number landed with precision. Each symbol tightened the structure. He didn't just correct the equation, he elevated it. By the third line, 2 grad students had stepped inside. By the 6th, the professor gasped under their breath. By the 9th, the room was full. When Miles stepped back from the board, 20 minutes later, the blackboard was nearly full, edge to edge with complex logic woven into beauty. Equations that had stumped seasoned researchers now flowed together like notes in a song. Silence filled the room. Not confusion, not disbelief. Recognition. Dr. Albright, a senior physicist who had spent 2 decades working alongside Whitmore, stepped forward and murmured, "He just restructured the dual residual theorem, clean." Another muttered, "And flipped the eigenvalue ratio, without collapsing the nested function." "That's not beginner work." Whitmore stared at the board. For the first time in his academic life, he had nothing to say, because the proof on the board didn't need defending. It spoke for itself. Nadine, who had been watching quietly from the hallway, stepped in now, tears standing in her eyes, but her chin held high. She didn't speak for applause. She spoke because the moment demanded truth. "You're all finally seeing what I've seen since he was 5. A few professors stepped forward awkwardly, trying to offer compliments. One said, "Incredible intuition." Another added, "What you've done, it's disruptive." In a good way. But Miles didn't smile. He knew exactly what they meant. He wasn't supposed to exist in this room. His brilliance wasn't supposed to be real. And now that it was undeniable, they weren't celebrating. They were recalculating. That night, the senior board of Cambridge University held a closed-door meeting. No press.
No students.
Only whispers. Because what happened in that lecture hall wasn't just a breakthrough. It was a problem, a disruption of the system. Accepting Miles's solution would mean rewriting years of journals. It would mean publicly admitting a black child from Detroit had surpassed one of their tenured elites. It would mean admitting they were wrong. Not just about math, but about what genius looks like. As the board debated, someone slid a thin manila folder under the table. Inside, handwritten in neat, black ink, was a proposal. Recommendation. Disqualify Miles Carter from official university endorsement due to probable external assistance. It didn't say who helped him. It didn't offer evidence. It didn't have to. Because in their eyes, brilliance in black skin still needed to be explained. As the meeting ended, and the room emptied, one chair remained pulled out, its occupant still inside, quietly holding the folder, and staring at Miles's proof with trembling hands. And this one, unlike the others, wasn't trying to disqualify him. She was thinking about what came next. The news of Miles's boardroom showdown spread quietly through Cambridge, like a rumor that people feared to speak aloud. Professors whispered behind closed doors, grad students exchanged glances over coffee, and administrators acted as though something volatile had been set loose on campus. But in Detroit, the fallout wasn't whispered. It was shouted. It was carved. It was thrown. While Miles walked across Cambridge courtyards, thinking only of equations and survival, his hometown became a battleground. He didn't even know he was fighting it. Back in Detroit, Jefferson Middle School held an emergency meeting, not to celebrate Miles, not to support the family, but to control the narrative. The principal, Monroe, sat with folded hands at the head of the teacher's lounge, his voice firm but frightened. "The Carters," he said, "have refused our guidance. They've become uncooperative with school protocol."
Uncooperative.
Ms. Ellison shifted uncomfortably. Uncooperative how? With media requests, with our recommended public statements. They're choosing to act independently. They're allowed to, she said quietly. Monroe's expression hardened. Not when it reflects on the school. There it was again, the silent expectation that black achievement must remain owned. Supervised, controlled. But Miles's brilliance was only acceptable if the school could take credit for it. The next morning, without warning, Nadine received a call from her supervisor at the office building she cleaned. "We're letting you go," the voice said briskly. "For what reason?" Nadine asked, already knowing the answer. "You've become a liability. Too much attention. Too much media chaos. We can't have disruptions." She hung up before her voice cracked. She didn't want pity. She wanted fairness. But fairness wasn't coming. Within hours, trolls online discovered her workplace, posted negative reviews, and flooded the building's social pages with racist slurs. They found out where she volunteered, where Miles had once played youth basketball, where they bought groceries. Then someone found their home address. The first warning came in the form of comments. "Figures he's from that neighborhood. Check his family's history. Bet there's crime somewhere. No way a kid like that figures out Cambridge math without dirty help." Soon the comments turned into direct threats. "Burn the lie.
Expose the fraud.
Stay in your lane." And then the vandalism began. Nadine woke one morning to the sound of someone yelling outside. She stepped out cautiously, one hand on the doorframe. Her heart fell. Spray painted across the side of their apartment building. In jagged red letters were the words, "Cheaters. Deport them. Stay out of white spaces." She stood frozen, her throat tightening. Neighbors stared but didn't approach. Some whispered. Some turned away. No one offered help. She went inside and locked the door. Her breathing came fast and uneven. Miles was thousands of miles away. Safe, she hoped. But she was here, alone. And the world had sharpened its teeth. Later that day, the landlord knocked. "You need to clean that up," he said flatly. Nadine blinked. "Excuse me? I don't want other tenants complaining. Your family brought this attention. Your responsibility."
You think we did that?
She said, voice rising. "I think you're causing chaos," he replied. And with that, he walked off. That night, back in Cambridge, Miles called home. "How are things?" he asked. Nadine hesitated. She thought about lying. She thought about saying it was fine. But he deserved more. "We're strong," she said instead. "Don't worry about us." He heard the strain in her voice. "Mom, what happened?" "Nothing we can't handle," she said. "You focus on what you're doing. You're doing something important." But after they hung up, she sat at the kitchen table and cried silently, her shoulders shaking. Meanwhile, online clips of Miles rewriting Whitmore's proof continued to explode across academic circles. Some praised him. Many doubted him. A few openly mocked him. One comment went viral. "A black kid with no private tutors solved that. Lol." Someone fed him the answer. Another, "Why is Cambridge entertaining this? Must be for diversity points." The comments stung, not because they were new, but because they were expected. Miles's existence in that room had disrupted something white, fragile and unspoken, and Detroit carried the backlash. A week later, Nadine walked out of her third job, caregiving for an elderly couple. They were kind people. They had always treated her like family. But their daughter, visiting from out of state, confronted her. "My parents don't need chaos," she said. "We saw the news. All these people online. It's concerning." Nadine swallowed her anger. "My son is being targeted because he's brilliant. Because he's black." The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, but we're uncomfortable with the attention." And just like that, Nadine was down to one job. By the end of the week, even Miles's school had quietly begun distancing itself. A letter went home to parents subtly implying that the Carters were disruptive. Teachers who once praised Miles now avoided his name altogether. Then the worst happened. One night, under the cover of darkness, someone defaced their apartment door. A word carved deep with a knife. "Fraud." Nadine stood staring at it, hand trembling. She called the police, but the officer who arrived barely glanced at it. He shrugged. "Could be a prank." "This is not a prank," she said sharply. The officer sighed. "Look, these online stunts blow over fast. Just stay off social media, okay?" She wanted to scream. Instead, she closed the door and sat on the floor, head against the wood. Meanwhile, Miles, completely unaware of the escalating danger, continued working late nights with Dr. Jennings via video call. They dissected proofs, refined equations, and prepared for the coming symposium. But every so often, Miles felt a twinge of dread, as though the world he left behind was shifting under his feet. The dread proved right. One evening, a soft envelope slipped under the front door of the Carter apartment. Nadine thought it was mail. She bent to pick it up. There was no return address. Inside were photographs taken from a distance, of Miles walking alone at night in Cambridge. Her hands flew to her mouth. Someone had followed him, watched him, documented him. And then another photo. A close shot of Miles entering a building. The timestamp was from days ago. Whoever sent it wasn't guessing. They were tracking him. On the back of the final photo, written in thick black marker, were 4 words: "You won't last long." Nadine clutched the envelope as though it were poison. And far across the ocean, Miles's phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "Call me immediately." As Miles reached for his phone, a notification appeared from an unknown sender. Another photo taken only minutes earlier of him standing in the very hallway he was in now. The image on Miles's phone froze him in place. A grainy but unmistakable shot of him standing in the same hallway he was walking through now. The timestamp read just minutes prior. He looked around slowly, heart thudding in his chest. The corridor buzzed with students, backpacks slung over shoulders, conversations echoing off the old stone walls. But somewhere among them was someone watching. Someone sending a message. Not just "we see you," but "we're right here." He walked calmly to a stairwell, took a seat on the cool steps, and called his mother. Nadine's voice was tight, cracked. "Baby, I need you to listen to me," she said. "They sent pictures of you walking around Cambridge. They knew where you were, what you were wearing. They're tracking you." "I got one too," Miles replied quietly. "Just now." The silence between them said everything. "You are not to go anywhere alone," she ordered. "I don't care if it's 20 feet. Be around people. You're not just visible now. You're a target." And she was right. The story that began with hope had become a firestorm. While Miles was still buried in chalk and theorems, the world outside had already twisted his image into something grotesque, a caricature, a pawn, a controversy. It started with whispers, then blog posts, then front-page headlines. British tabloids moved quickly, splashing his face across their sites with titles like "Cambridge Genius" or "Media Hoax," and NASA retiree accused of coaching child prodigy behind closed doors. The press didn't even pretend to separate fact from suspicion. Dr. Jennings watched the coverage with quiet fury. He'd always known this day would come, that the system wouldn't collapse quietly. Still, seeing his name dragged through the mud again, this time as an accomplice to academic fraud, reopened wounds he'd learned to live with. "They think I programmed you like a robot," he told Miles during a late-night call. "As if I downloaded genius into you. They never believed I could do this on my own." Miles replied, "Now that I did, they need a different story." The narrative shifted fast. Media outlets that once celebrated him now rephrased their praise with caveats. Anchors described him as well-coached, extraordinarily trained, or mentored into brilliance. The implication was subtle but consistent. This couldn't be real. Cambridge stayed silent. No statements, no defense, just tension. Until one name changed everything. Sir Malcolm Leston. A tech billionaire and longtime Cambridge donor, Leston made headlines of his own when a private email leaked. In it, he threatened to withdraw over £30 million in pledged funding if the university didn't restore academic integrity. He didn't say Miles's name, but he didn't have to. The email read, "We cannot allow our institutions to platform optics over rigor. If the standards bend, the credibility crumbles." It sent a shockwave through Cambridge. Departments scrambled. Legal teams panicked. Some professors went silent. Others distanced themselves from Miles, no longer returning emails or sitting near him in lectures. No one wanted to be caught in the fallout. Back in Detroit, news stations replayed clips of Miles rewriting Whitmore's proof. But now the captions read, "Too perfect to be true." Conspiracy forums lit up with claims that Jennings had ghostwritten every equation. One article accused Nadine of manipulating identity politics for media sympathy. A particularly cruel op-ed accused her of exploiting her son's intellect for public favor. Miles watched it all quietly. He didn't respond, didn't defend himself online. He saved his answers for one place only: the board. Dr. Jennings remained his constant, guiding him, grounding him. When they question you, Jennings said, don't fight them with outrage. Fight them with precision. Let your proof be the rebuttal. Then came the summons. Dr. Lynette Crawford, head of the mathematics department, requested a private meeting. Her office was sleek, cold, and smelled of fresh paper. You've created quite the stir, she said, barely glancing up from her desk. I didn't ask for it, Miles replied. No, but you're in it now, she said. And this university needs to respond. She slid a typed letter across the table. A public demonstration. 3 days from now, you'll solve the proof again. Live. Before faculty, students, media, and Sir Malcolm Leston. Miles stared at the paper. You want me to perform? No, Crawford replied. I want you to prove, once and for all. Clean, undeniable. He nodded, slowly. You should also understand, she added, if you fail, they won't just doubt you. They'll cite you as the reason students like you don't belong in these halls. Miles stood, folded the letter into his pocket. Then I won't fail. The next 72 hours were chaos. Cambridge buzzed like a disturbed hive. Reporters camped outside. Anonymous posters appeared, calling the event a publicity stunt. Someone hacked a projector in the campus library, looping a deep fake of Miles speaking gibberish, with the word fake flashing across the screen. The hate didn't stop there. A blog titled Whose Mind Is It Anyway? Accused Jennings of orchestrating everything, citing his past NASA experience as evidence of fraud-level ability. One conspiracy thread on Reddit claimed Miles was a child actor hired to push a woke agenda into STEM, and still Miles said nothing. He saved every drop of hurt, every ounce of anger. He poured it into the chalkboard. The night before the demonstration, Jennings called one last time.
You nervous?
Yes, Miles admitted. Good, Jennings said. That means you know what's at stake. But remember, the proof doesn't care who writes it. It only asks one thing, that it's true. The next morning, the university auditorium was packed wall to wall. The front row housed every power player, Whitmore, Crawford, Jennings, donors, professors. Cameras lined the walls. Journalists whispered predictions. Supporters cheered. Detractors smirked. Miles stepped onto the stage. He looked out over a sea of eyes, doubting, curious, hopeful, hungry. He walked to the board. I was told I didn't belong here, he said. Told I was too young, too American, too black. Told I was a shadow of someone else's mind. He held up a fresh sheet of paper. So here it is again, from me, to you. He picked up the chalk. But just as he drew the first line, the back wall projector glitched, and the screen behind him flickered. As someone hijacked the feed with a countdown clock, no one expected. 3 minutes, red numbers, and underneath prove it, or disappear. The countdown timer blinked violently, behind Miles. 2:58, 2:57, its red glow casting sharp lines across the lecture hall walls. The audience stirred with confusion. Murmurs rippled across the room. Students leaned forward. Cameras shifted. A voice from the back called out, "Is this part of the presentation?" But no one answered. Miles stood frozen in front of the chalkboard, chalk trembling in his hand. He didn't turn to look at the screen behind him. He didn't need to. That clock wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. A demand. Solve it under pressure. Solve it while watched. Solve it even while being stalked. Then Jennings' voice pierced the confusion. Keep going. Miles turned slightly. Jennings was standing now, his voice calm, but firm. You solve it, he said, because it's yours. That sentence locked into Miles's chest like armor. The nerves didn't vanish, but something deeper, heavier, anchored him. He turned back to the board, took a breath and drew the first clean line. The countdown ticked on. 2:34, 2:33, 2:32. But Miles was no longer hearing it. He was inside the math now, moving through it like a path only he could see. With each line, each adjustment, each curve of chalk, he reclaimed ownership of something everyone had tried to rip from his hands. As the board filled with variable shifts and rearranged logic, the crowd's noise fell away. Even the skeptics sat still. Even Whitmore, at the edge of the front row, leaned forward unconsciously, pulled in by the sheer velocity of Miles's focus. At 1:57, Miles reached the midpoint, the hardest turn, the part where even trained scholars stumbled. He paused for less than a second, then flipped the vector, adjusted the instability, and delivered a shift that dropped jaws. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "He's doing it." Someone else in disbelief said, "No, he already did." But Miles didn't hear any of it. He was too deep. Line by line, function by function. He made the equation bend, not through memorization, but through command. The proof unfolded like a painting under his hand. By the time the board reached its final section, the audience had become a wall of stunned silence. Dr. Crawford sat stiffly, hands tight in her lap. Jennings's eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked it away. Whitmore looked pale, not in anger, in awe. At 0:57, Miles reached the final step. He slowed his hand deliberately, not for drama, but because this moment would live in history, and he wanted to feel every second of it. And then the last stroke. Chalk, slash, done. The final symbol clicked into place just as the countdown hit 003, 002, 001. And then, without warning, the screen behind him glitched and blinked out. The countdown vanished. Static, then darkness. Miles stepped away from the board, complete. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was thunder held in breath. And then came the clap. One. Sharp. Slow. From Professor Harrison Whitmore. Miles didn't react. He just stood still. Then another clap. Then more. Dr. Crawford rose to her feet. Jennings followed. Soon the entire auditorium stood in applause. The same room that doubted him now thundered with recognition. It wasn't a celebration. It was an admission. Miles had rewritten something no one thought possible. Not just the proof, but the expectations of who was allowed to solve it. After the demonstration, the media swarmed. Students buzzed. Faculty members hovered. But Miles didn't stay. He slipped out the side door and walked across the courtyard alone. He needed air. He needed stillness. When he reached his room, the sun was slipping low across the stone buildings. He placed his hand on the door, exhausted, but alive. Then, a knock behind him. He turned. There stood Professor Whitmore, the man who once dismissed him. Whitmore didn't speak right away. He looked different now, not humbled, but something closer to unsure. "Miles," he said, "may I come in?" Miles opened the door wordlessly, but Whitmore didn't move. Instead, he pulled a sealed envelope from his coat and held it out. "Before I apologize," he said quietly, "you need to see this." Miles took the envelope, and inside he found something that would make everything more dangerous than ever before. Miles held the envelope cautiously, feeling the thickness of the documents inside. It wasn't heavy because of the paper. It was heavy because of what it represented. For a long moment, he didn't open it. He watched the way Professor Harrison Whitmore stood at the doorway, stiff, uncertain, almost fragile. There was something unfamiliar in the professor's posture, not arrogance, not control, but something that almost resembled humility, or maybe guilt. "Go on," Whitmore said softly. "Open it." Miles broke the Cambridge seal and unfolded the first page. His eyes scanned the heading. Bold, formal, undeniable. Formal recognition of original contribution by Miles Carter. His name, printed. Not debated. Not in quotes. Not in doubt. Beneath it was a publication heading, a co-authorship offer, naming both Dr. Harrison Whitmore and Miles Carter. Miles's jaw tightened. A recognition that should have felt triumphant now felt dense, complicated. Because this wasn't a gift. It was a correction of a wrong that never should have happened. Whitmore cleared his throat. "That is the official acknowledgement from the board. And the second document," he pointed to the next page, "is the co-authorship agreement." Miles looked up slowly. "You want me to sign this?" Whitmore nodded once. "Yes. I want the world to understand the mathematics correctly. And it deserves your name." He paused. "They need to see what you did." Miles let the paper fall slightly in his hand. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. Not yet. He waited. Whitmore inhaled, as though he'd rehearsed this moment, and still didn't know how to begin. "I owe you more than a signature," he said quietly. "I owe you the truth." Miles crossed his arms, waiting. "When I walked into your classroom in Detroit," Whitmore said, "I didn't see potential. I saw a stereotype." His voice cracked just slightly. "I saw a black boy, and I assumed limitations that weren't there. That's racism, Carter. That's what it is. No academic term for it. No softening racism." The words hung in the room, heavy, overdue, and suddenly too small to cover the damage. "I shaped the way I saw you before you ever spoke," Whitmore continued. before you lifted your hand, before you solved anything. And I carried that bias with pride. Miles exhaled, slow and sharp. You only see it now because I proved you wrong. Whitmore didn't flinch. Yes, he answered. Because you forced me to confront what I refused to see. Because you did what I believed you couldn't. He hesitated. And because I realized how many young people I've shut out by thinking the way I did. The guilt landed between them like a table neither wanted to sit at. Miles thought of his mother, scrubbing floors until her hands cracked, losing jobs because of him, standing against threats alone. He thought of the racist graffiti, the doxing, the vandalism, the pressure. He thought of the world that demanded he perform miracles, just to be treated as human. He thought of every room that only opened after he forced the door with brilliance. Miles held up the agreement. You want me to co-publish this with you? I do, Whitmore said. The work is extraordinary. You deserve authorship. You deserve credit. And the world will understand the theorem faster, with my name attached. It was the closest he could come to admitting, my name is the passport you never should have needed. Miles placed the paper on the desk. So now I get acceptance? Now that I've already survived your doubt? Survived this university? Survived the media? Whitmore swallowed. You get respect. From me. From the institution. Miles shook his head slowly. Respect that only came after I was superhuman. Whitmore blinked. I won't deny that. And I won't pretend it's enough. Silence again. Then Miles stepped forward. I'll sign this on one condition. Whitmore straightened. What condition? You create a scholarship program. Miles said. His voice was steady, firm, older than his age. Not symbolic. Real. Full rides. For underprivileged black students in math and science. Whitmore blinked. A full scholarship program. A real one. Miles said. Not a yearly token. A system. Funding, mentorship, admissions opportunities. Pathways you all pretend don't exist. Whitmore exhaled. That's not a small request. No, Miles answered. But I'm not a small mind. The room felt tighter now, as though the air itself was listening. You want this to be bigger than you, Whitmore said softly. It already is, Miles replied. You changed my life with one sentence when you dismissed me. So now I'm going to change someone else's with one decision. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, studying him, really studying him. Not through bias, not through discipline, but through the clarity that only comes after being shattered. I'll take it to the board, he said. No, Miles corrected. You'll fight for it. Whitmore nodded slowly. I will. He extended his hand. Miles didn't take it at first. He stared at it, not out of disrespect, but out of the knowledge that it symbolized something fragile, a bridge built too late. Then finally, slowly, he placed his hand in Whitmore's, not as forgiveness, not as friendship, but as a contract of change. Whitmore exhaled, relieved and shaken at once. But Miles wasn't finished. One more thing, he said. Whitmore looked up. Yes? You apologize, Miles said. Not to me, publicly. To every student who ever sat in your class and was treated smaller than they were. Whitmore stiffened, pride flaring, old habits resisting. But then his shoulders sank. Yes, he whispered. I will. A long silence settled. And for the first time, the professor who once stood at the front of the room, towering with arrogance, now looked like someone learning, truly learning for the first time in years. The next morning, before anyone could react, news alerts lit up across academic circles. Young black prodigy forces policy shift at Cambridge. New scholarship announced. Praise flooded in. Interviews multiplied. Cambridge found itself at the center of a global conversation about race, access, and academic gatekeeping. But while the world buzzed, something else stirred. In places Miles couldn't see, in hidden forums, private chats, closed networks, a new group was forming. Angry, anonymous, influential. People who didn't like change. People who didn't like Miles. People who didn't like doors being opened. They called themselves Purity 2, and they weren't celebrating. They were preparing. Their first message appeared online that night. Targeted, coordinated, and unmistakably threatening. The vanguard falls next. When Miles stepped off the plane in Detroit, the chill of the Michigan air cut through his jacket, but it was the sea of people waiting at the terminal that stole his breath. There were banners, cameras, teachers, strangers, neighbors. A brass band played off-key but joyfully. His mother stood at the front, eyes wet, holding a hand-painted sign that simply read, "Welcome home, Miles." He froze, stunned. Just weeks ago, they'd been vandalized, doxxed, humiliated. Now the same community had returned to lift them. People clapped. Some cried, and others stood in silence. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't have the words to express what it meant to see one of their own, not just survive, but return triumphant. Nadine wrapped him in her arms, tight and warm. "You made them see," she whispered. But even as the love poured in, Miles knew visibility came with a cost. He could feel the weight of being a symbol, a boy who represented more than himself now. Media flooded the days that followed. Miles was invited to speak on national networks, his face appearing next to words like prodigy, reformer, voice of a generation. But Miles dodged the spotlight when he could. He was done performing. Now he wanted to build. Cambridge formally announced the scholarship within a week. The Carter Scholars Initiative, a multi-million-dollar commitment to fund underprivileged Black students in STEM. The announcement sent shockwaves through academia. Institutions scrambled to issue statements. Some praised the move. Others called it excessive. But the message was clear. The gate had cracked open. And Miles wasn't done yet. With Dr. Jennings at his side, he launched something bigger. The Vanguard Project. It wasn't just about scholarships. It was about creating access, mentorship, community. The program aimed to identify Black students with untapped mathematical potential across the country, not just in gifted schools but in forgotten districts, crumbling classrooms, and homes like the one Miles came from. Jennings watched proudly as Miles led meetings, drafted outlines, interviewed regional coordinators. "You're not a student anymore," he told him one night. "You're the architect." Applications flooded in. Donations followed. Schools reached out, eager to host Vanguard pilot programs. What began as a single victory in a lecture hall had ignited a national reckoning. But not everyone applauded. In the shadows of online forums, a different kind of conversation grew. Anonymous threads popped up on message boards. Users with coded names and dog whistle language dissected every detail of the scholarship and the Vanguard launch. "They're buying access now. What about white kids who are poor? This isn't equality, it's revenge." At first it was just noise, static in the distance. Then the threats began. Emails to Jennings's inbox, anonymous messages to Miles's school, encrypted posts with coordinates and references to past attacks on social programs. One message stood out, a simple image of a chain, snapped in the middle, with the caption, "We fix what you break." Jennings brought it to the FBI. They opened a case. Miles refused to back down. He tightened security protocols, moved the Vanguard project's servers to encrypted networks, hired cybersecurity consultants. But behind his calm exterior, Nadine could see the tension building again. "You're not alone this time," she reminded him. "But you can't carry it all alone either." He nodded, exhausted. "I'm trying not to." Late one night, while reviewing submissions from a school in Mississippi, Miles noticed something strange. One application repeated the exact same phrasing as another, from a different student, then another, and another, a pattern. He traced the IP addresses. All four came from the same VPN cluster. Someone was trying to infiltrate the Vanguard program, not to join it but to poison it from within. He called Jennings immediately. "We've got a mole." Jennings went silent, then calmly said, "This is bigger than math now." The next day, a new group appears online, Purity 2025. Their mission? Restore merit, erase agenda, and their first target, the Vanguard Project. The threats didn't stop, but neither did Miles. Each morning his inbox held new warnings, veiled insults, doctored images, posts calling him a fraud. But he answered none of them. Instead he answered the letters from children, from parents, from students in overlooked neighborhoods, who wrote things like, "I didn't think I could be good at math until I saw you," or "I'm the only Black kid in my science class. Now I don't feel alone." Miles read everyone. And he kept going. The Vanguard Project launched its first 5 centers within the year. Detroit, Atlanta, Newark, Memphis, and Oakland. They weren't elite institutions. They were converted libraries, community centers, backrooms of churches. But inside, kids sat with notebooks, faces lit up by possibilities. They learned not just equations, but how to see themselves in places no one expected. By the second year, Vanguard expanded to 15 cities, then 30. Miles spoke at universities, summits, and conferences. He walked into rooms that once closed their doors to him, and now begged him to return. But he didn't wear a suit. He wore his own name, proudly, simply, fully. He refused to become what they once demanded, a quiet, grateful exception. Instead, he became something louder, a permanent disruption. The threats from Purity 2025 grew more organized, even dangerous, but they underestimated two things: how prepared Miles had become, and how many people now stood with him. Parents fought for him, lawyers defended the program, students posted videos dismantling hate, one proof at a time. Dr. Jennings, aging but undeterred, remained by his side. "You're what I always hoped to see before I was gone," he told Miles one evening, watching a classroom full of black students graphing nonlinear functions. "You saw it before I did," Miles replied. Journalists continued to try spinning his story. Some labeled him a media construct. Others tried to pit him against other prodigies. But Miles always brought the focus back. "This isn't about me," he'd say. "It's about every kid who was told they weren't enough." He refused to become a symbol of perfection. He let people see the fear, the exhaustion, the pressure. He didn't hide it. He used it. Cambridge, now fully partnered with Vanguard, instituted a new admissions pipeline. The Carter Scholars graduated into fellowships, tech internships, university placements, and they didn't just succeed, they shattered records. At age 15, Miles received the Presidential Medal of Science. When he stood at the podium, the room waited for something polished. Instead, he looked straight into the cameras and said, "Someone once told me I was probably only good at sports. I want to thank him." He paused, and the room froze. Because sometimes, the fire you light under someone is the same one that burns down your ignorance. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Whitmore, now semi-retired, watched from home. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just nodded. That moment would echo for generations. In the years that followed, the Vanguard project changed thousands of lives. Children who would have slipped through cracks now built bridges. One became a NASA intern at 16. Another won the Fields Medal by 23. Dozens became teachers, spreading the fire further. Miles never forgot Detroit. He returned often, not as a guest, but as a builder. The school that once erased his name now bore it above a STEM wing. His mother walked through those halls one day, alone, touching each wall. She smiled. "He did that," she whispered. And still, Miles kept pushing. Not for praise, not for revenge, but because he remembered what it felt like to be dismissed. He remembered the sound of laughter in that classroom, the weight of being underestimated. He remembered the insult, and he remembered the choice he made after, to rise. As the screen fades, a new hand reaches toward a chalkboard. A young black girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, stands with a marker, rewriting a problem while her classmates stare. In the corner, a faded poster reads, "The Vanguard Project, because genius has no color." The girl pauses, then writes the final answer. Correct. Another spark. The cycle continues. The revolution lives. They silenced his voice, until he made the world listen. They tried to define his worth, until he rewrote their rules. If you've ever been judged before being seen, if this story felt like truth wrapped in fiction, type yes. If you believe in justice, subscribe if this broke your heart.